Okay, in this video we're going to continue talking about the range function a little bit and iterables. Okay, so let's make a new file here and call it iterable.py. Okay, and so when we have a range function, in the last video we discussed the difference between the range object and then actually generating a list of all of the items that a range object can reference, and having all of the items in the list proved to be have a major impact on memory, right? Especially for very large lists anyway, right? Our memory shot up, so this is a display of my system's memory, and it shot up when we had the list of all of the items because each one of those items was stored in memory. Where with a range, we calculate them one at a time. And so with the for loop, the idea of the for loop, we have for I in, and then something that is iterable. And again, what does iterable mean? What is iteration, right? So we have some iterable thing. And an iterable is something that has a starting point, and it's an ordered collection essentially. So it has a starting point, and you can get to every element in the iterable, assuming it's not an infinite iterable. But you will eventually get to every single item, and that there's no loops. You won't encounter necessarily the same item. You won't get in a situation where you calculate the same item, which leads to another number that you've already calculated, and you won't get into any loops, right? So you'll count everything in the list one time until you get to the end, or it'll keep going to infinity, right? So iterable is, just think of it as an ordered collection. Anything in Python that's an ordered collection. So like a string is an ordered collection because it's important that when we read this string that the S comes first. Otherwise it's not the word string, right? So there is an order, there's a starting point. We can get to each character until we get to the end. Okay, so these are things that are iterable. Okay, what is an iterator? Okay, so an iterator is the thing that allows you to get to the next item. So one iteration is going from, if we go back here to string, one iteration would be grabbing this first item, right? The next iteration would be grabbing that next item. So each iteration grabs one item from the iterable. So this is the same for strings as it is for a list. So it has a beginning, we iterate and we get the first item, and then we iterate and get the next item, and then we iterate and get the next item. So that reference to next is actually the function name that they use to access items in an iterable. Okay, so in Python, how do we create an iterable? So I can have, first let's make a range object. We're going to say this is range 5. Right, and then we can make a list object that's the same. It's the same idea, right? So this list object is going to go ahead and create the list, and all 5 items are going to be stored in memory. In this case, they are not, right? So I can make an iterable by using the iter function. So anything that is iterable, you should be able to make an iterator by using iter. So a range is iterable, and so I can create an iterator with it. And then while true, so this is going to be an infinite loop, I can call, let me print out, I use my iterator, it, and then I call next, right? So there's a number that we get, and this is a global function next, and I pass in my iterator, and it gives me the next value from my iterator. So remember, the iterator was constructed by passing in something that is iteratable, some collection that is ordered, right? Then I call next on the iterator. And the iterator always has a position in the iteration process that it's keeping track of. Okay, so this is going to return the number, right? So the next function, right, we talked about iterating over the list. It's the next thing in the list. One after the other. Has a starting point, and one after the other, you go through the values. You iterate over the values. So each time through the loop, we have one iteration, right? And we calculate a number in one iteration, and then print it out. Okay, so this this should be an infinite loop, right? Theoretically. But depending on what happens with it here, our iterator. So we'll see. Let's run this Python 3 iterable. Okay, and we see we get all the values from our range function, right? 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then we get this. This is an error, traceback, right? Iterable.py is the file, line 9. What's at line 9? Well, that's where we call next. So if the iterable ends, right, if there is no next value, then Python, the mechanism here for Python is to throw an exception, okay? And it's a stop iteration exception. So what we need to do is we'll try to do this thing. So this gets into try or exception handling, right? We're going to try to do this thing, and if no error occurs, then great. But if we do get an error, we're going to go into this exception block, right? And if we get the error, then we just want to break out of the loop. Okay, so that'll break us out of this loop, even though the condition here is set to always be true. If you encounter the break statement inside of the loop will break. So we're only going to print the value, you know, if this try actually succeeds, meaning there actually is a next item in the iterator. All right, so we run this, and so this is more the style of what's happening under the hood when we talk about a for loop. Okay, so and just to show, we can use this with the list also. So I've got the list value up here. I'm swapping that in for our range value, and lists are obviously iterables as well. They have a beginning and an end, and you can go one at a time. You can iterate through them one at a time, right? So back to our range scenario. This is effectively what's happening under the hood when we have something like this: for I in range, print I. So this syntax is quite a bit shorter than this, right? So Python sees this. Let's get that right. It's range 5. So Python sees this as an iterable, right? And since it's in a for loop, it automatically makes it an iterator, right? Then this is all done for you automatically with this syntax. And it makes the iterator, and then each time through the loop, it calls next and stores it in this value, right? So this is essentially our I value, right? So this is our for syntax. And then this is our while iterator syntax. So again, we see that, you know, as I've said before, the while loop is the more powerful loop. You can do everything you need to with a while loop, but the for loop, it's just common to need to iterate over a list, right? So it's a very nice syntax. It's quite a bit less to type out and less to think about, right? So this is longer, and you have to try, accept, and that sort of thing. But you see, we can accomplish everything with while. It's just longer sometimes, right? So the for loop is just a shorthand syntax for it, because it's really common to need to iterate over a list of items. Okay, so the while iterator syntax, and we see both of these things essentially result in the same value. And so with this syntax, also the range function, we get the property, because this is an iterable and it doesn't automatically generate the list. So we get the benefit of neither one of these methods hogging resources that we don't need, right? So in neither one of these scenarios do I need to access all of the different I values at once, right? If I had a list of all of the items, then all of the items would have to be stored in memory. Okay, so that's sort of the idea behind why the range function doesn't return a list, and sort of what goes on under the hood of Python when you have these. This is sometimes called syntactical sugar, right? It's a sweet way to do something long. So you have a sweet syntax that's really short to do something that might otherwise be a little bit tedious, right? So syntactical sugar is sometimes the name they give that. So there's sort of a lot going on here, but from the human perspective, we can look at this and say, oh, you've got a variable and then range 5, which makes a list, and then each item in the list is stored in I, and then you print that item. And that's not entirely true. It can be true, but there's actually more going on, and there's much more going on than this, too, when you break things down into a lower level language. Okay, so that's part of the reason we're exploring, mimicking Python and showing how Python does some of the things that it does, because all of the tools we use are actually constructions, that somebody's had to put a lot of time and thought in, and it saves us time to not have to do those, because we can think more humanly about these things, whereas we know, as far as computer science goes, pretty much everything breaks down to ones and zeros, and humans aren't good at just managing a bunch of ones and zeros, but computers are incredible at it, right? So finding this way to communicate in a somewhat technical way, but still human readable, right? Which is what Python is. It's a high level language, very human readable, but it still ultimately translates down to the ones and zeros and that sort of style that the computers are so good at managing, right? So anyway, this has been a little bit on the range function and iteration.